And in this idea of museum, perhaps in that immediate idea of as a space where we have artifacts from the antiquity display, uh, in an academic consideration, especially from a culture studies perspective, the space of museum or the site of museum is more than a space of display, right? We know the condensation, we know the arguments around, disputes around the space of museum. Especially recently, we had many, claims of countries or ethnicities claiming their artifacts back into their country, repatriation, right? So that's on one side. On the other side, there is this idea of the problematics of museumization and museumification, right? We have both the issues there. The problem of selection and rejection in terms of artifacts, in its worth, in its merit to be considered for display at a museum, the politics at play, the operations of power in selecting artifacts, in selecting elements from uh, cultures, and in rejecting artifacts from particular cultures, uh, whether it to be considered for display at museum. There are a lot of other elements also. So more than a space of display of antiquity, we have the space of museum as a space of arguments, as a space of disputes. And it is at this context we consider museum as a topic in a discussion on culture. We have these 10 aspects of culture in discussion in this series. And in that 10 aspects of culture, we have considered museum, the space of museum, the debates around museum, the problematics and the play of power at museum, in formations of museum, the problematics of museumifications, all these into consideration, into discussion in our discussion on culture. And in order to present this idea for us, we have Dr. Rose Sebastian with us. Dr. Rose is a very good friend of mine, and she's a brilliant football player. More than anything, I know her. She is our teammate. We played in a team during our research times, and she has her post graduation and PhD in culture studies, focusing on museum especially as a area of interest. And Dr. Rose is working as an assistant professor in Kerala now. So we are, especially I'm personally more than happy to have Rose here with us. With due respect, Rose, I would like to ask you to, start the discussion. Um, Right, and a couple of housekeeping things. We will have a presentation by Rose, roughly for an hour, or as she wants it, and then we will have a discussion, open discussion with the resource person. All right, thank
Okay.
you, and Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Naufal and the organizers. I'm so honored to be part of this event organized by the Department of English, PSMO College. Naufalika, as he told, is a senior from the university and a very good friend. He was my football coach, and it's always fun to work with him, whether it be for football matches or lecture series. Thank you for inviting me. Uh, and I think Naufal has pretty much briefed on whatever I had to say in this lecture. I'll try starting the presentation. Just a second. And I also thank all the participants who are here on a Thursday evening. Is this visible? Is the presentation visible?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes.
Okay. So today we look at the museum culture, uh, by which what I have in mind is to look at the institution of museum from a culture studies mode of thinking. Now, when I say a culture studies mode of thinking, I think it would be nice to start from basics. Culture studies is not simply the study of culture, but an interdisciplinary critique of the politics of cultural practices. Now, this explanation has three key terms or phrases in it. One is interdisciplinary, then is critique, and the last phrase is politics of cultural practices. By which it would be clearer with an example, I feel. For example, if you look at the art form of Kathakali, if you're looking at the costume of it or the makeup of the art form, or if you're looking at the aesthetic aspects of it, you are looking at a form of culture, yes, but it has not entered the field of culture studies yet, because in order for your study, your project to qualify as a culture studies project, you have to ask unconventional, critical questions to it and problematize the power play that underlie a certain cultural practice. So if you ask questions like, who are the performers? How does the system of caste reflect in the performance of Kathakali? Who are the practitioners of that art form? Who are the people categorically excluded from the performance of Kathakali? Or where is it performed? What kind of space do you require for a Kathakali performance? Is it street or some sort of a sacred space? So if you ask questions like this to a form of art, then it becomes a culture studies project. In the context of museum, it becomes interdisciplinary because you're taking an object of study which has been traditionally dealt by the disciplines of museology or sometimes archaeology. Now you're going to approach museum from a different point of view, from unconventional point of view, and you are going to ask critical questions to it. And you're going to critique it, not in the sense, critique doesn't mean criticize. It's more than criticize. It means a deeper, nuanced analysis of your object of study. So here we might have to rely on the disciplines of history, anthropology, political science, sociology, economics to fully understand the museum from a culture studies point of view. At the same time, being aware of the further politics that shaped these disciplines of history, politics, and economics at certain points in history. So, just a second. So what we are trying to do here is to approach the museum not as a given. In order to critique anything, you shouldn't take it for granted. You have to ask questions about what are the conditions of possibility for it, what shaped it in a certain way, in a certain point of time. What are the why? How was this institution of museum formed over centuries by, say, various socio-political developments? So you're basically trying to trace the genealogy of the museum to truly understand the power play, the power equations that underlie the functioning of the institution. So, to start with the precedence of the museum, the modern public museum as we have it today, did not exist before 18th century, but the precedents can be traced to the medieval cabinet of curiosities and menageries. And the characteristic features of the antecedent of this kind of antecedent of the museum is that they were private in ownership and access. Those were owned by the rich, the aristocratic, mostly kings and princes. And they were also private in the sense that not everybody, you or I couldn't take a ticket and go visit their menagerie when we wanted. So they were limited to exclusive crowd. And they were intended for a display of power and pomp of the honor, in the sense that if you're a king, the kind of objects which are on display might be gifted to you by neighboring kings as a sign of friendly diplomacy. or it may be gifted to you as a token of subordination by your vassal states or vassal kings, or it may be again gifted to you or made for you by the artists or craftsmen that you're patronizing. So in that way, the collection of a king or an aristocrat was a show off of the kind of power he wielded. And sometimes it was just a show off of affluence of the honor. And from the perspective of the viewer, from the perspective of the consumer of this kind of collection, the aim was to trigger wonderment. People, so I wouldn't be able to see the Google Meet window. I can only see my PPT. So in case there's a comment, if I cut out of the call, you might have to give me a message, Nafika.
Sure, sure.
All right. Yes, so for the visitor, the aim was to trigger wonderment in the sense that they were supposed to be amazed at the money which went into it, or the craft which went into the making of these artifacts. It was more or less an idle kind of a viewing. There was not much of other activity or thought which went into it. And the organization of this display and the artifacts was very random. There was no rationale or category along which these menageries were arranged. So Tony Bennett, in his work, The Birth of the Museum, he looks at how at a certain point in Europe's history, the medieval menageries and cabinet of curios gives way to the modern public museum. And this happens around the 18th century. And the ownership, both ownership and access to these collections become public. So again, let's ask the question, what must have been that particular socio-political development that happened in Europe in 18th century in order to facilitate this? So a certain phenomenon or event must have happened at a coming together of so many factors. This wouldn't have happened had something else not happened. So I want you to tell me what must have happened there in order for the democratization of the museum to take place. You can comment in the comment box. So there are so many ways of looking at the museum, institution of museum. This is just one of the possibilities. I'm talking about this certain possibility because my PhD project was on this, but there are so many other ways we could look at it. But if we get the algorithm of it, the grammar of how to ask critical questions to an objective culture or a culture practice, then we would be able to replace this particular perspective with n number of possibilities. So when you ask, how did this museum evolve? How did something that was private in the 17th century, 16th century, all of a sudden become public? Somebody steps in and says, no, these things, art, craft, heritage, belongs to the people and should be made accessible to the people. These are not private things to own. Democratization, what must have been that particular very famous event? Anyone? 18th century, so 17th. Yes, so Sri has answered rightly. It's the French Revolution. So it had far-reaching, yes, Rosemary. So it had far-reaching consequences, of which the first was that it set up an atmosphere for democratization of not just the political system, but a lot of other institutions and associated practices. So with the French Revolution, there was a violent takeover of everything that was, you know, how the Bourbon kings were hung to death. And there was a lot of public anger against the rich and the royal. So their palaces, their wealth, everything that they owned were taken up by the public and the government that came into power after the dynasty fell. So the ownership of heritage and history was considered to be that belonging to all the people, and the access becomes public. Now, this didn't happen in a moment. It happens over several decades in 18th century. Now, so you have an older form of power, which is monarchy, giving way to a newer form of power, which is republic or democratic government in its rudimentary form, though. So we have this phenomenon happening in a lot of other places also. In India, if you look at The Salar Jung Museum in Hyderabad, that would be a best example, because Salar Jung was the ruler of Hyderabad until the much after the independence of India also, and after the acquisition of the state of Hyderabad into the Indian Union. The cabinet, his collection of interesting, he was at some point, the Nizam of Hyderabad was at some point the richest man in the world. So he had a lot of private collections, and all that becomes part of a museum that the government takes over, and the access also becomes public. Even in Kerala, you have examples where the objects, collections of the erstwhile royal families were turned into public museums in later. So this is a process that has happened all over the world. Now, yes, there's an ideal of egalitarianism to the democratization of the museum and how it became a public space. But there's also another aspect, that is of the population management. In the post industrial Europe, when you had its towns and cities teeming with people, somehow the government had to manage it. So a number of techniques emerged in 17th century, 18th century for population management, what Foucault calls governmentality. So these people had to contain crime and to contain the people, to have a control over the masses of people. Certain institutions and practices comes into being, and public museum becomes one among it, because to keep the crowd away, an ideal crowd is a dangerous crowd with potential for rebellion, and it was a politically very turbulent and volatile period in Europe. So you had to keep the public energy in check. So the governments focused on providing rational recreation for the public. So uh, public museums, public parks, libraries, etc., come into being. So you have to understand that for this to happen, the idea of public sphere has to emerge. Now you see that for the museum, modern museum, to take shape, take birth as we have it today, a lot of things, historical, social things had to happen. That is one, the French Revolution and the ideas of democracy had to emerge. The idea of modern nation state had to come, because the nation state is then acting on behalf of the people, and the idea of public sphere, as Habermas talks about it, had to emerge. And it's at the confluence of all this, a number of socio-political developments, that something like a public museum emerges in the 18th century. And for an institution or a place to provide rational recreation, it had to be ordered in a very systematic way. We saw that the private menageries and collection of curios were very random, haphazard. You saw that in the previous picture, a lot of things which were apparently unrelated to each other were placed in the same shelf. Because the intention was not to teach. The pedagogical function of the museum was not there in the medieval times. But when you're into crowd management, into population management, into governmentality, you need to arrange things according to categories. You need to taxonomically, systematically arrange this thing. So orderliness becomes a characteristic feature of the public museum. And it also facilitated, when something becomes public, you can no more say that, okay, only the aristocratic can come in. So the new public museum, it facilitated an intermingling of classes, and it was designed to be so, just a second, designed to be so that the industrial working class could refine themselves, look at the elite class, look at the aristocratic, and emulate them. So you didn't want the carnivalesque kind of behavior or the energy, but you wanted disciplined bodies following the instructions put up in a certain space, and being obedient to the instructions from above. So the space of the museum and the arrangement of the museum had to be redesigned to cater to this particular need of polity, of public management, that emerges in that point of time. Again, there was also the purpose of surveillance, because museum then becomes not just a site of seeing, but a site of being seen as well. So the dark rooms of the medieval collections wouldn't suffice. So the space of the museum had to be redesigned. The architecture changes to permit very well lit, spacious corridors and rooms. So these are the kind of changes that happens to. These are the characteristic features of the modern public museum as it took shape in the 18th century. Um, I want you to tell me, assuming that most of you are Malayalis, to tell me the exact translation of the museum in Malayalam or any other Indian languages for that matter. Do we have an equivalent of the museum in Malayalam? What do you call a museum in Malayalam? Yes, Sri says Karsha Banglavar. What else? What do you call it in Hindi? It's called a Sangrahalay, a Karsha Banglavar. Yes, it's Arun Kachiyagam in Tamil. Again, the word Kachiyagam is there. Kachi is site, Agam is the space for it. So if you look at the words that we have in Indian languages, whether it be Karsha Banglavar in Malayalam, Sangrahalay in Hindi, or it's also called Ajabgar or Jadugar even, uh, you see that these terms, all these terms have they're more associated with the medieval idea of collection than with the modern museum, public museum. We don't have an exact equivalent of the word museum. So if something doesn't, a word doesn't exist in your language, then it means that the referendum probably exist in your culture or society. We don't have an exact equivalent of museum, but we have words which resemble the menageries and the curios. They were also called wonder houses, which is where we have Ajabgar and Jadugar from. Sangrahalay basically means a place of collection. Okay, Kachiyagam basically means a space for seeing things. None of these, in truth, captures the essence of the museum and its modern functions. Because the museum did not undergo the democratic transformations, the social transformations in India that it underwent in Europe. So just like the political system of democracy, constitutional democracy, which was an import, which came as part and parcel of independence, the museum was also a colonial import in India. We did definitely have the private collections of the kings and the princes, but it did not undergo the social processes, the democratic processes that it underwent in Europe, which is why uh, we don't have a word in Indian languages which stands for the modern function of the museum. Now, if you come to India, the modern museum comes to India in the form of colonial museum. The first ever museum to be established here is the Indian Museum of Calcutta, which was established in 1814. And this was part of the knowledge project of the colonial regime. There was a lot of interest in Asiatic studies and Indology at that point of time. And Asiatic Society of India was established, and those scholars, the community of European scholars, and there were a few Indians as well in it, they collected things for their study, which was mostly anthropology, archaeology, zoology, botany, etc. They were interested in linguistics also. So they were collecting materials for their scholarly pursuit, and at some point they felt that it would be nice to have a space for it. And it's the collection of the Asiatic Society of Bengal that eventually gets transformed into the Indian Museum Calcutta in 1814. So if you look at what are the characteristic features of the colonial museum, definitely the knowledge project, European scholarly projects, that is definitely a part of the Indian Museum. And there's also what Christopher Pinney calls the salvage paradigm. By salvage paradigm, what he means is that the European scholars were churning out data. They're producing a lot of data in a lot of fields regarding connected to India, whether it be language studies, history, archaeology, art, anything, with the ideological vantage point or the moral vantage point that they were collecting the history of a land which did not have a scientific way of collecting or preserving history, or they were doing it on behalf or for the benefit of a people and a land which do not have proper systems of knowledge. Okay, so the salvage paradigm was definitely there, and this ideology was also a validating principle for the colonialism. They said, okay, we are doing this for the Indians. Then there was, of course, the colonial economic extraction, the drain of wealth theory, as it goes. So they were trying to promote their commercial interest and trade interest. So there were a lot of collections on goods that would produce money, and these exhibitions or collections were set up in order to promote the trade in materials or the goods that the British were interested in, which included a lot of botanical products, zoological products such as the leather, and then there was also stuff like tea, coffee, spices, and there was a lot of interest in Indian geology because of the mining business was making a lot of profit at that point of time. So mineralogy was there, spices was there, textiles was there, art and craft was also a part of the industries. Remember, it was not part of a different art section or fine art section. Most of art and craft went into the industries where, because the British were making money out of it. Then there's definitely the function of surveillance that the museum served, but this surveillance is different from the surveillance function that the European counterpart of the colonial museum had. The surveillance of the museum was in the form of collecting a lot of ethnographical data uh, for the purpose of having a control over the subject society. So, after the initial phase of military expansion and invasion, they realized that in order to be able to control the colonial subjects and the society, you need to have data about them. So they started um, vigorously producing knowledge, and all kinds of institutions of knowledge production and data collection and enumerations were set up, like such as the Archaeological Survey of India, Ethnographical Survey of India, Botanical Survey of India. So all these institutions of survey and knowledge creation comes into being, and especially the ethnographical and Survey of India, and the discipline of anthropology is interesting here, but because they were involved in a lot of projects that concerned with the study of criminal societies in the colony. For example, they would collect physiognomic features, craniological features. Phrenology was a valid discipline at that point of time. So they would basically study the nasal index, the shape of face, or the proportion of facial features, or the volume of the skull, in order to make moral assumptions, civilizational assumptions about the communities in India. So the communities in India were categorized into friendly, dangerous, etc., etc., on the basis of the collections or the data created by these institutions and bodies. And museum uh, partakes in this process because museum houses large number of specimens which aided this kind of studies. So the Indian Museum Calcutta at that point of time had a huge collection of skulls, and which is where all the craniological studies were happening. And there are records where actually the scholars say this collection of human crania, of skulls, would help us understand where these communities, each communities in the subcontinent, stand in terms of evolution, or if they are reliable, if they are friendly, if they are violent. So basically, something that sounds so wrong today was a valid field of study at that point of time, which is where the last point comes in, that of social Darwinism. So social Darwinism basically assumes that the European white male is at the apex of the civilization, is at the end point, is at the pinnacle of the evolutionary process. He is the fittest that survived the best, whereas the other human societies are in the process of getting there. So the museum becomes a site of all these kinds of concerns and functions. Now we have discussed three types of music, or three phases of the museum: that of the menagerie, that of the initial phase of the nascent phase of the European Public Museum, and the Colonial Museum in India. And I did this so that we could think about how India, after it became independent in 1947, would want its national museum to be. So soon after India became independent in 47, or even before that, in many years preceding the independence, there were a lot of discussions, not just in academia, but in in the bodies, administrative bodies, legislative bodies, that we do need a museum, because it became a prerequisite to show the world that you are a civilized society and you are a modern nation capable of ruling itself. So it became a requisite of culture, modernity, and nationhood, which is why Kavita Singh says, to assert for a nation to assert itself, it needs a national anthem, it needs a national flag, but it also needs a national museum. Poor is the society which cannot find enough artifacts and objects which in order to fill its museum. So when once India becomes independent in 1947, there's a lot of deliberations going on as to how should the first national museum be. So definitely it had to be different from the European museum or the colonial counterpart, because now the national government is instituting the museum to represent nationhood. So here the museum comes in as a sign, as a symbol, insignia of the nation. So what would the possible themes of it be? If you were given the charge of it, how would you want it to be? So is there a trouble with the voice?
I suppose it's fine. I
Okay,
can clearly hear you. Yeah.
all right, all right. So, to take a personal analogy, which might help us better, if you enter a club, if you want to be the member of a new club, and then you are to introduce yourself, and you are to make yourself acceptable to the rest of the members of the club. Or even better, if you are to write a family history, present a family history in front of a group of people, you would make certain selections and omissions. Like Nafil said in the introduction, there are selections, careful selections and omissions and erasures that go into the making of any kind of narrative, historical or otherwise. So when you write a family history, if in that chronicle there are certain things you wouldn't want to be there. There are things you push under the carpet. You don't want to mention about a certain mean aunt. You wouldn't want to mention about certain fights in the family or certain illegitimate relationship that must have happened. You only want to present that is those factors about which you are proud. So if a nation is writing its family history, or if a nation is trying to form and forge a, 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 a profile for itself, a biodata for itself, what would that be? What would be the theme of the National Museum, or what were the possible themes of the National Museum at that point of time? I had something coming up in the comments. Um, no answers in the comments. Any answers? If India were to represent itself in front of the world, this is our self. So the idea of the theme of the nationalist movement, yes, diversity of our country was definitely there. One of the themes which were suggested was the nationalist movement, the freedom struggle. But at the point of time, at that point in the late 40s, the history of the freedom struggle was yet to be written. It was only in the 50s that a committee was formed by the parliament to write the history of the freedom struggle, and we couldn't wait for another decade for the National Museum to be set up. As I said, it was an emergency requirement. It was a prerequisite to nationhood. So we had to rely on something which was already there, but redefine it in a certain way. So the nationalist Indian independence movement was definitely a potential theme for it. Various buildings, religious texts, and institutions. Yes. I don't know if this was under consideration, but definitely at that point of time, when you're setting up nation as the National Museum as an insignia of the nation, antiquity of the nation becomes an important factor, because there's an anxiety of a young nation which just comes into the club of world nations. India had to say that though we were formed technically as a nation only recently, India as an idea, as a civilization, as a value system has existed since time immemorial. So, as Benedict Anderson says, as much as a nation is modern, it is antique, it's ancient. So, this antiquity of your civilization, of your roots, to say that we have been here for a millennia or so becomes important for a young nation. Okay, so they chose, finally they choose that the antiquity, this Indian civilization, should be displayed and celebrated in the National Museum. And stone sculptures, this is by Tapati Guha Thakurta, in Monuments, Objects and Histories. She looks at how the burden of India's antiquity fell upon the stone sculptures, because those were the things that would have successfully.
Rose,
Yes.
Rose, 1 second. We have a second comment in the chat box saying it's not audible. Let's see if this is the case with many other people.
All right. No worries.
Can somebody else respond if it's audible for you guys?
It is audible for me, sir.
Yeah, so it seems many people are saying it's audible. So I suppose those would be the problem with those two people then.
Connection.
I'll try to fix it I'll try to talk to them. Okay.
All
Yeah,
right.
you
All
go
right.
ahead, Rose. Yeah.
Okay. So, since stone sculptures would have best survived the test of time, the burden of India's antiquity, the burden of India's representation falls on these stone sculptures for two reasons: not just their antiquity, also for the fact that they were readily available. So, the Archaeological Survey of India had dug out a lot of artifacts and materials, and the collection was so rich that you didn't have to waste time finding artifacts and objects to fill the museum. They were readily there. So if you go into the National Museum, you see that most galleries are filled with, at least the initial galleries, you're welcomed by a long series of stone statues. But these were reimagined in the sense that in the Colonial Museum, these are archaeological artifacts, these archaeological objects and discoveries were part of the colonial narrative, in the sense that the salvage paradigm that we discussed about, the Archaeological Survey of India in its initial years, in its colonial phase, they operate along the salvage paradigm, saying we are digging out and preserving the history, the civilization of a land which is not capable of doing it for oneself. Okay, so and so it's kind of validated the colonial activities in the subcontinent. And also they were taking a lot of these pieces away. It's like if you have a piece of history, the British will take it away. So now the museum is taking those artifacts that previously belonged to the colonial narrative and reimagining and reassigning values to it. Now it becomes a nation standing for its own, telling its own story in front of the world. So there's this, it's the same objects, the signs are the same, but the system is different. One was colonial narrative. Now these signs enter a new language of nationalism, of patriotism, of national heritage. Now they entirely constitute a different narrative than it did in the Indian Museum, Calcutta. So it's important for us to ask the question as we walk into the National Museum, what are the continuities and ruptures that the National Museum established with the Colonial Museum? Like I said, the objects were the same, but the narratives that the objects constituted were entirely different. And definitely there was a lot of thought that went into what should be there and what should not be there. So the archaeological collection of the Indian Museum was rich. Equally rich was its geological collections, or its botanical and zoological collections, or anthropological collections for that matter. None of it would go into the National Museum. At least it wouldn't constitute the main gallery. There are anthropological collections, but not in the main galleries. A lot of it is in the basement, and there are smaller, not so important galleries there. Because anthropology, basically, if you look at the history of the discipline, the Europe had sociology to study its own society, and it had anthropology to study the colonial subject. So again, the epistemology of these disciplines become important. So each we have to be, when we rely on these disciplines to look at something, We have to be at the same time aware of what are the historical processes that must have shaped these disciplines in certain way. So we did not want anthropological collections because we were now not looking at us ourselves in an evolutionary mode, but we were presenting ourselves as a civilization which is on par with other world civilizations such as the Mesopotamians or the Chinese. That's how the first gallery begins. You have a representation of the Mohenjo-daro civilization, which is juxtaposed along with the other ancient civilizations of the world. Now the botanical or the zoological or the industry economical collection of the colonial museum wouldn't definitely go into the National Museum, because the function of the National Museum is not profit. The motive is not profit. It is not there to make money, but it is there for a symbolic purpose of standing for the essence of India, of the spirit of India. So all these things would not be coming there. The social Darwinism of the colonial museum, though, would reappear a few decades later in the tribal museum when the national elite is looking upon its own marginalized communities. So it wouldn't get a major place, major show. It wouldn't get major place in the National Museum, but it reappears in the later constitution of the tribal museum in independent India. So then these are only some instances where we can ask such critical questions. What are the continuities and what are the discontinuities with the European colonial practices, with the colonial museum practices, etc. And while constituting the museum, if you look at the policy documents and the deliberations that went in the administrative level, you see that certain sections were to be categorically avoided. They said we need only ancient objects and artifacts in the National Museum. You can have some other institution for the medieval and modern art. Photographs were to be strictly avoided. Statues of anything that had to do in the colonial period, for example, the statues or the signs of colonial rule were to be excluded from the museum space. The medieval history was also to be excluded from the museum space. Also, the regional, something that was very regional was not important. So there's a lot of discussion on how the museum, space of the museum, excuse me, the space of the museum should only include objects of national and historical importance. Now, that particular phrase or that particular prerequisite to get into the space of the National Museum become interesting, because then you ask the question, how do you deem something if something is of national importance or historical importance? This becomes interesting in the process of the acquisition of objects to the National Museum. So once the decision was taken to set up a museum like this, letters were sent out from the Ministry of States to all princely states and kings and people who would have collections to donate their private collections to the National Museum in order to contribute to nation. So the response to this kind of plea to contribute was interesting, because a lot of princely states happily ignored the letter from the Ministry of States, because they did not quite understand what is this Union of India suddenly ordering us to do something. And they were holding on to their private collections. Some rulers were happy to contribute to it, and they said, we have these objects, so we would be happy if you can visit and you have a look at it and take away what you want. Some other kings, they enter into a battle of ownership with the Indian Union, saying, no, you can't take away these things because these are values of sentimental importance to us, or value of these things are of regional importance. For example, the province of Punjab and Patiala and East Punjab, they get into a battle with the National Museum Committee over the ownership of certain artifacts that were found in the region. So they argue that these things are of very regional historical importance to the region and cannot be taken out of the region. There are yet other rulers who realized the importance of this new form of political power of the nation state and wanted themselves to be seen within the new system. Like the king of Bharatpur, he had a collection of Gupta period coins. So he said he'll donate it to the National Museum provided he do it in a public function, and he'll only hand it over to the President of India. So the president had to make himself available to collect these coins, the donation from the king. So if you look at the responses of the erstwhile rulers to this new form of government, these are basically response letters to the request to donate things to the National Museum. But by extension, it becomes the previous form of power responding in various ways to a new form of power. So as I said, the National Museum, its functions, its intentions, by extension becomes the intention and operation and function of the statehood itself, which is why Tony Bennett says the rationale of the modern museum is the rationale of the nation state. And if you look at the exclusions, other exclusions in the National Museum, you wouldn't find a lot of things from the medieval period, of course. The Mughal art, though very rich in a lot of way, you will only find scattered collection. You don't have a gallery to the Mughal period, because one thing it is from, there was a policy decision to not give focus to the medieval period, but also that while the Maurya period, Gupta period, Kushanas, Shatavahanas, they all get very spacious galleries to those period. The Mughal art or regional art or the Northeast, they appear in the National Museum as part of scattered collections. So these are some kind of interesting patterns in display we see at the National Museum. So as I said, when the National Museum was established, it was established as an insignia of the nation, and its function was largely symbolic. In the decades that follow, the museum comes to serve a different purpose. Once we embark on a modernity project, where the Nehruvian period of dams and big hydroelectric projects and mining projects come in place, you have a flurry of science museums coming into place, standing for the modernity of the museum. So the National Museum of Art and Architecture, if it represented the antiquity of the nationhood, we have science museums and museums of democracy coming up in the later decades, standing for the modernity of the museum. Reminding us of what Benedict Anderson said. Like I said previously, a nation is modern and ancient at the same time. It need to make claims to both antiquity and modernity at the same time. If we trace the history of the types of museums that have come up in India at various points of time, we can see that whether it be the art and architecture museums, science museum, tribal museums, all these kinds of museums were responding to certain political requirements, economical requirements that came up at certain phase in the evolution of India as a nation state. So the assumption, the common assumption is that the museum is a site of culture, of valid knowledge, of objective truth and history. But if going deeper, we find that the nation state is shaping the narrative of the museum, and at the same time, the museological narrative is in turn shaping the nation. Like Stuart Hall says in Representation, the process of representation is not representing what an objective reality that is out there, but the reality is constituted through the very process, in and through the very process of representation. This is where we might have to look at the dialectical relationship between the polity and its narrative forms. Now you can replace the museum with media, with television, with the Doordarshan culture. You can replace the museum narrative with other forms of narrative, but you see that there's a construction of an idea of nation through narrativization, through representation. And these days, history have become a site of heated contestation, which is why it is important for us to look critically into these narratives. And there are a lot of other aspects of it, possibilities of it. that I would have wanted to talk about, like the problematization of the tribal museum and the representation of indigenous communities. But I think we can do that in the Q&A session.
All right. Okay, Rose. That's thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. uh, I was, fully into it, and then all of a sudden you said we'll hold it here. I suppose you should have gone a little more. Anyway,
I didn't want to delay dinner any further.
yeah, yeah. I should expect that too. Anyway, we will have this discussion now. It'll be good if you can turn your mic on and say your question rather than making it in as a text in the chat box, I suppose. So yeah, please, people, you can start.
Yes, Sri has a question.
Hello, it's not a question, but I would like to add something to the discussion. So, in the beginning part of your talk, you talked about this intermingling of classes or the democratization of access to these places that were earlier exclusive. So, this is I'm not sure whether this has something to do with museum, but I'm reminded of a scene from this series called Downton Abbey, wherein the public is given access to the interiors of this huge mansion called Downton Abbey. So the series is set in a time where class relations is taken a turmoil with the two wars happening in the world. So while the inhabitants are not sure of what to show around or how to describe an artifact or how to narrate the history of what is being displayed in this huge mansion, the common public is all too excited to get a peek into this luxurious lifestyle of the barons. So I think that kind of access doesn't it still arise a curiosity among people to aspire for that kind of a privileged existence even today when we visit museums, or when we get access to history that was once not
Yes.
accessible to everyone.
Yes, that's definitely there, which is why all this museums of in Kerala, if I speak in the Kerala context, if you there's still a lot of curiosity about how the Kochi or the Travancore royal family must have lived, and people want to look at how those people lived. But to add something to the class dimension of it, in Europe, they also, as I said, it was a politically very turbulent period. So administrators wanted to avoid class conflicts. So if a class was very far away, removed from the public, they were afraid that it would trigger revolts and revolutions and rebellions. So they wanted to bridge the class difference. And also later in the 19th century, the Labour Party, must not be in 19th, in the 20th century, the Labour Party becomes very powerful in England, and then there are policy and legislations made in order to reduce the distance between several classes and bridge the class difference further. Yes.
Rose, we have a question in the chat box. Would you read it?
Yeah, sure. Okay. How are the tribal museums implicated in the perception of indigenous people as prime? So yes, most of the tribal museums that I've been to, whether it be the Nehru Centenary Tribal Museum in Hyderabad or the Krit Arts Museum in Calicut, they represent the indigenous societies of India, not very differently from how the colonial museum represented the natives. So you have though the apparent theme of the tribal museum is the indigenous communities and their welfare, the narrative is arranged in such a way that the nation state is ultimately the hero. So if you look at the tribal Nehru Centenary Tribal Museum, as it was when I was researching it a few years back. I heard they have recently redesigned the museum because of certain criticisms and feedback that came in from the public. But at that point of time, they even had the center of the museum in 2015 had the life-size diorama of a very bloody and gory human sacrifice, which is called the Meria rite, which was practiced by the Gonds of certain district. So this must have existed some 200 or 300 years below, but the central installation in a tribal museum was that of a human sacrifice. And then you had again then the initial halls started again with the study of physiognomic and craniological features. You had a display of the evolution of man. You wouldn't find this in the National Museum. You wouldn't find this in the Birla Science Museum or the Vishweshwaraya Museum in Bangalore. But in a tribal museum, in the Nehru Centenary Tribal Museum, the narrative began with a representation of the representation of the evolution of man, like Neanderthal, Homo erectus, and then coming into Homo sapiens. So where the narrative starts, and then it starts with the narrative is very much that of social Darwinism, and all the dioramas which were set up represented the tribal as stuck in the past. You don't see the present day life of these people. And also the indigenous communities are not consulted. They are not included in the setting up of the museum. Not sometimes they're consulted for the thing, artifacts are bought from those communities sometimes, but they do not have an involvement in the narrativization of the tribal museum. So it becomes very much like again, in the middle of the Hyderabad city, you had something called Shilparamam, where the indigenous societies were fetishized in front of an urban crowd. So it was almost like putting up something for your voyeuristic consumption. The main problem was that these communities, the stakeholders, are not involved in the making, in the museumization, in the narrativization of their own stories. And a story that begins with the evolution of man, which starts with the Neanderthals, it ends with how these communities there are charts and statistics on how these communities have benefited from various state projects in the fields of health, education, irrigation, etc. So as I said, though apparently they state that this is for the welfare and promotion of the indigenous societies, the narrative invariably, whether it be the Museum of Art and Archaeology or the Science or Indigenous Society, the hero of the story is nevertheless the nation state. I'm talking about the museums which are set up by the government. There are private museums, and there are museums set up by the communities where the story might be different. So what I've discussed in this presentation is just one of the possibilities. I reiterate it, to look at the museum, but there are several other points of views and critical questions possible about museums.
Hello, Roshni. Don't you think there is a question I want to ask? Don't you think that hello? Can
Yes,
you hear?
yes, ma'am. I'm listening.
Yeah. Don't you think that whatever that is present in the museum or showcased in the museum requires specialized knowledge, and they do harp on that common people or laymen will not be able to get the meaning of these things. So they can very well easily build a narrative which showcases or perhaps privileges their meaning, the ones that make the museum.
So which is why the museum of the curator or the museum of the museological expert, I would say, is a thing of the past. Which is why, so when that's what we are doing, we are trying to do a interdisciplinary critique of the museum here. Means something which was traditionally and always dealt by museologists, archaeologists, now need to open up to the criticisms and comments and feedback from practitioners and scholars from other disciplines and the communities concerned. So the new museology involves all these stakeholders. They take all these people into the process. And if
Yeah,
you see,
I did listen to Sadanand Menon once.
Hmm.
He is an art critic who deals specifically with museums.
Hmm.
Have you listened to him, Sadanand Menon?
No, not yet.
Okay.
So this is the problem. If you continue, if you focus a lot on specialization and expertise within a certain discipline,
Yeah.
sooner or later you become redundant and very exclusive.
Yeah.
So the entire concern of
No, I'm not talking about focusing on it, but there is that possibility of the narrative being built on the meaning of the expert or the nationalist. Because the laymen or the common people are not educated on that, or they are not allowed access to knowledge, privileged knowledge. That's what I was hinting at.
Okay. Is that a comment or a question?
It's a comment.
Oh,
It's a comment.
okay, ma'am. Yes. Thank you.
Rose, you have a question about the purpose of private museums in India. Aren't they focusing more on the commodification of cultural artifacts rather than inducing nationalist pride? This is from
Yes.
Jane Mary.
The private museums, I've not looked deeply into the private museums, but the private museums do not intend a lot to promote the national pride, yes, but sometimes they are instated in memory of a person and to keep up his legacy. Sometimes, yes, there are market interests at play where there's also exhibitions along with the museum. There's a sale and exhibition going on along with the museum. So yeah, it is definitely there. So I was focusing on the museums which were run or set up by the governments. Private museums entirely have a different rationale. So do the museums run by communities, which do not belong to either of these categories. They're not state museums, they're not private in that sense of the word, but they belong to communities, to represent their own communities. Yes. So each type of museum would have their own priorities and their own rationales and intentions.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, ma'am. My question is that I have heard it's about museum year paper. So my question is that I have heard an interview from Manu S. Pillai, who wrote this Ivory Throne, right?
Okay.
So he was talking about most of his material for that book is from London. Okay, so every history, every king, queen, Sethu Lakshmi Bai, that Travancore queen. So what's your opinion about that, ma'am? You told so many things about museums. So what is the British museums are concerned more about our culture? Our things are there, even the Kohinoor time, whatever we say. So what's your opinion? Could you elaborate it more about that British museum in London?
All right. So most of my archival work about the Colonial Museum came from the British Library, London as well, because we didn't have those data in India. So along with they took.
That's why I asked. I heard his interview. That's why I asked this question.
So so if it's a ongoing debate of repatriation. So after independence, interestingly, India had raised claims to a lot of things that the British took away during colonial period. Some of those things, sometimes they complied, but they soon realized if they complied to all such requests, the British Museum would soon be empty. There's a joke that goes on like, it's only because the pyramids are too heavy to lift that they're still in Egypt. So definitely, I don't know. So the claim. So I happened on this case where Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was a diplomat, Indian High Commissioner to Britain, was
Nehru's sister.
into a legal battle. She didn't.
Okay.
It wasn't a legal battle, but she was negotiating with the British Museum people in order to return certain Buddhist relics to India.
Mm-mm.
But the claim, so then you enter into an interesting debate there. So she was saying that these things are of religious importance, sentimental value to the people, so those should be returned. But the British Museum was saying that these you shouldn't think from a narrow point of view that these belong to the community. These are part of the world heritage. So as part
Okay.
of history, they belong to all the people, and they have all the while preserved it, and their
Okay.
preservation requires them to be retained in the museum.
Okay.
The question of repatriation is a highly debated one. I don't think there's a simple solution to it. I wouldn't be able to say this is right or wrong, but there are
Mm-mm.
several aspects to it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Rose, there are a couple of other questions in the chat box. Should I read it for you?
No, I'll oh.
Yeah.
Please suggest some books that would provide further insight. Okay, the one I mentioned, which is The Birth of the Museum by Tony Bennett. Then you could try out the entire oeuvre of Tony Bennett. He has worked in the field of heritage. And then you have Roots, Routs, Roots by James Clifford, which would again give us a lot of thought about the object and its value, material culture. Then in the Indian context, we have Tapati Guha Thakurtas, Monuments, Objects and Histories. We have works by Hilal Ahmed. Then we have Kavita Singh. These are the authors we could check out for more information on this field. Just the basic text. Is there a minor space allotted to the Mughal art and other forms of medieval art in the National Museum, New Delhi? Okay, Monica is asking if the kind of spatial division that is at the National Museum represents some sort of a communal bias. I would say yes. From the narrative, it seems like they wanted the nation to be elitist and Hindu, majorly. Hindu and both Buddhism and Hindu artifacts get a lot of attention there, while a lot of other regions, communities are sidelined. Like I said, the Mughal art does feature in the National Museum. There are coins and miniature paintings from the period, but there's no gallery dedicated to the Mughal period despite its cultural richness. There was a policy decision to to downplay the medieval period for whatever reasons. Um, but then you see that the Gupta period gets a lot of space. You know that the Gupta period was celebrated as the golden period in ancient Indian history. So yes, the Mauryas and Guptas, and the Harappa Mohenjo-daro civilization also gets. And after the the Harappan civilization, they trace it back to the 3000 BC, and then there's a jump to the Maurya period, I guess. So everything that comes in between these two periods is lost, and all the medieval exhibits are scattered all over the place. There's no well arranged, systematically organized galleries to the medieval period. So you could say that the lack of orderliness when it comes to the medieval period. Again, Tapati Guha Thakurta says that the river of Indian history, which keeps on flowing from dynasty to dynasty in the ancient period along the ancient Hindu and Buddhist regimes, suddenly becomes very scattered pools of water as it enters the medieval period. So one could actually be apprehensive of the communal nature of this narrative. Yes. Manu clearly mentions that. Okay, so Shri is suggesting that the British had better record keeping systems and better access to the inner events and happenings of the royal houses. Yes, that could be true. And the India Office records in the British Museum, which is where most of my archival work on the Colonial Museum happened, they have a lot of information that we ourselves do not have in India. As I said, they have taken the archival data along with them, not just the artifacts. If you personally ask me, I believe that these things should be returned. But I am also aware of the long debates and several aspects of the repatriation question that happened.
Yeah, even in that point where who has the right to display
Yes,
whose property, right?
yes,
It's
yes.
so
So interestingly,
especially.
Hina, yes, Naufal,
No,
you're
I
saying
was
something.
wondering if, especially in that context where you said the social Darwinism took some delayed time to appear in the context of museumization in India. So you can, like, very well think it as a delay in considering or allowing the marginalized communities representative elements or artifacts as giving them some values or merit that makes it worth to be presented as some element from India to the
Yes,
world,
exactly,
right?
exactly, exactly. Yes, so this is best reflected, as I said, in the process of acquisition of objects to the museum. So there's a committee sitting deciding which is not worth exhibiting in the space of the National Museum and which should definitely be there. So the response from the princely states and the provinces also become indicative of the fact that the if you donate, the rhetoric goes like, if your state, your region wants to be part of the nation, then your artifact should be part of the National Museum. Something to be forcefully excluded from the space of the National Museum was indicated that a certain community, a certain history was forcefully excluded from the nationalist historiography. Yes, the inclusion or omission from the space of the National Museum by extension is indicative of your inclusion and exclusion from national history.
But then, Rose, can I add one
Yes,
more,
please.
yeah, point to discuss it? In that context, we have I suppose we have another issue when we include a particular community, a marginalized community, especially into the museum. There is this problem of doubt on the intentions of their inclusion, whether it's a commodification or whether it's a fetishism or kind of like objectifying them to be marveled at, kind of like, oh, what kind I mean that adding the feather into the I mean the Native American
Mm-hmm.
aspects, that discussion. So there is this element of doubt cast on the purpose behind including the marginalized communities or the tribal communities artifacts into museums, right? So
Yes, yes.
at one point we have this accusation of excluding, and at the other side we have the accusation of
No,
objectifying, right?
objectifying.
Right.
But I think that depends on the nature of the narrative novel, in the sense, a narrative of exoticization, fetishization can be to, I don't know. Yes, that's a tricky terrain. Yes, sometimes when you represent, it is for commodification, but then the exclusion also becomes a problem. I have to think more about it in a deeper way in order to be able to comment on it. But then, in the very act of display, you're distancing a certain community from the mainstream, is what I believe. Because do you find, you, you don't find you and I in the museum? To be part of the museum definitely means there's a certain distancing and alienation from what is perceived to be the general uh, and the mainstream. Yes.
Rose, I wanted you to share your thoughts on one more thing. Then I'll stop asking. Okay, last piece. I want your thoughts on this recent trend. I suppose it's recent because I just started looking out about this museum stuff very recently, since we had agreed on your presentations to be on museum. Then only I started working on this. So I think there is this trend on making an increased public participation in curatorship or in the
Yes.
making of the museum itself.
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
making it a space more than just come and, in a sober or a very serious outlook, you look at the artifacts and go back, rather than sit down there, work on the items or contribute into the
Yes.
artifacts,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
What's your thoughts on that transformation?
See, these transformations came from the criticisms that came over time against conventional museology. So, the first kind of museums to become interactive and participatory were science museums, because they wanted children or school children or the participants to be part of the process that were happening. And later they thought this would be a useful paradigm to adopt to other kinds of museums as well. And it's a very, I believe that it's a progressive move to take the public into trust, take the stakeholders into trust, and uh, to work together as a collective to set up a certain narrative of something important. I think it's a good sign, and it's part of all the criticisms and studies and feedback that have come along against conventional museology. So the new museology, it focuses on interactive side of setting up installations. Yes.
Thank you, Rosemap, for that wonderful lecture. So, my question is not related to museums per se, but then it's related to knowledge imperialism. So, given there are still inaccessible documents like the Botany papers in the office records, how far knowledge imperialism hampers the project of decolonization, and what is the antidote to knowledge imperialism in this current era? Like how is the scholars from post-colonial societies like India is responding to
Exactly.
the persistence of knowledge imperialism? Thank you.
Yes, that's a very good question, because it's sad that actually someone who is researching on the history of India or Indian museums had to go all the way to the London or to the UK to study about our own history. So yes, the knowledge imperialism is continuing in a certain way, and there are some sort of a benevolent colonialism happening, because they are funding research projects and researchers in India to be able to travel to UK to get access to information about our own history. But yes, this does actually hamper research of Indian students or the post-colonial student a lot, or not just research in a lot of fields. The fact that they still continue to have ownership in certain fields of knowledge over certain objects is hampering decolonization to a great extent. Yes.
Thank you.
Rose, you have a couple of questions in the chat box.
Yes. Yes, is there such interventions in the museum? Yes, there are political. As I said, if history has become a site of contestation as to who was what and who did what, then the museum, as a site of culture, as a site of display of history, will definitely become a space for contestation, political contestation, and that is happening. Interventions and manipulation in history is extending to the space and narrative of the museum as well. How do you, the Logame Taravada project undertaken by Kochi Binale Foundation, also about the global value of Binale. Now, as I said, if you get, I wouldn't comment on it because it's not something I've looked at in a deep enough fashion. But as I said, you have an object of study, which is a practice of display, whether it be the National Museum or Binale. And if you get the grammar of the kind of questions you should be asking, if you get the algorithm of it, you should be able to ask the same kind of questions to Binale. The global value of Binale happened in Kochi because Kochi and Muziris, because I think there was an idea of cosmopolitanism which was associated with Muziris and Kochi. So when Binale was happening in other major cities of the world, Kochi was picked for this forgone cosmopolitan nature of the city. So the global value or cosmopolitan nature of the Binale as an art exhibition, that is a possible line of thought, in the sense I would have to look into a lot of data into it before I come in. But what I say is that's a possible research area, very valid and potential research area. Okay. Feedback. Shall I fill one feedback form now, Phil?
Yeah. All right. I think, Rose, maybe we can call it a session, right?
All right. It's 9 o'clock.
Yeah, it's 9. Our plan was 1 hour 15 minutes, so it's already past that time schedule. So for the official purpose, I want to thank you, Rose. This was a wonderful presentation, and I suppose this will be one of our flagship essay in our collection of essays of this decalect that we are bringing out in the coming February, hopefully. Thank you, Rose. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for preparing such a
Thank you so much. I was so happy to
beautiful,
be
yeah.
part of this. And thank you for
And
all the ones who stayed.
yes, thank you to the participants. We know it's difficult to find time in these days, especially. So thank you so much for joining the discussions. Thank you all. I suppose our next session is on 10th. That's an offline session. We'll hold it in the college auditorium, and then we will record it and upload it in the YouTube for those who cannot make it to the PSMO college auditorium that day. That's on 10th, and our next online session is on 13th. That's on investment culture. The offline session is on printing culture. So yeah, those who can make it to PSMO, you're welcome on 10th to PSMO college, and otherwise we will see you online on 13th, the same time. Okay, thank you and good night. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.